Hello, BookTube. This is Jack, the Rambling Raconteur, and I've been working over the past day and a half on a book I picked up last weekend, Uncertain Glory by Joan Sales. He's Catalan, so I'm not quite sure how his first name is pronounced, but he was a Catalan combatant during the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, and then years later worked through his experiences in the during that war in the late 1930s, and created this novel. And it is absolutely marvelous and astounding. I'm really, really excited. Probably early next week to do a video where I talk about the book as a whole. And it's a fascinating look at how truly terrible all war is, all human conflict really is, but particularly during the 20th century as combat became more mechanized, how quickly lives could change and how instantaneously decisions could be made that would affect others, would affect entire towns, entire families, just on such a massive scale. And he was somebody who was really living through that and experiencing all of that, and he took all of that emotion, all of that horror, and then within it he distilled it into this incredible work of beauty that really just draws into the human mind and into just cuts really deep into the mind, and draws on emotions that are just so deeply felt and vital. And I know I'm not going to finish it today, but it spurred my mind. I've texted a few friends about the book and said, like, has anybody ever heard of this? It's amazing. I just came across a copy last weekend and picked it up by happenstance. It was at a very low price at the used bookstore, and it's without a doubt one of the finest books I've ever read. And it got me thinking around some other writers who wrote about 20th century war, 20th century conflict, and did it in some very particular styles or particular ways. The one I want to highlight very briefly today is the great Russian Jewish writer Isaac Babel, who served along with the Russian army in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution. So after World War I had ended, there was a war between Russia and Poland, sort of around 1919, and he was among the Red Army. I can't remember quite if he was a journalist who was going along or if he was an actual combatant, but he rode with this group of Cossacks who had been repurposed into the Red Cavalry. And that's the title of this book of stories he wrote, which is Red Cavalry. I read it probably about 10 years ago for the first time, and could tell right away from the third story, this was an amazing writer. He creates these stories that are sometimes 3 to 10 pages often. They're very rarely longer than about 10 pages, but often 3 to 6 pages, that just highlight these moments of the life of this group of Cossacks and those who are going along with them, and the people's lives that are involved. So I wanted to I found one of the what in my opinion one of the stronger stories, which is a story about a horse. And I want to just highlight some of the ways Babel uses his language to craft this tiny little gem of a story, and then it's each of these stories is almost like the gems in a crown, and they all just fit together to create this entire work of Red Cavalry that's just about 150 pages total, but that gives you this almost panoramic sweep of what was going on during that conflict. And so this is Isaac Babel. The replaced division commander lived alone. The staff officers who used to fawn on him didn't recognize him now. They were fishing for roast chicken in the smiles of the army commander, and, in their eagerness to please him, turned their backs on the chief who had once covered himself with glory. Reeking of perfume and looking like Peter the Great, Savitsky lived in forced retirement with Pavla, a Cossack woman whom he had lured away from a Jewish supply corps commissar, and with 20 thoroughbreds that we all considered his property. The sun streamed full strength into Savitsky's yard, yet seemed to despair at the inadequacy of its rays. In his yard, foals were eagerly sucking at their mother's dugs, and grooms, their backs wet with sweat, were sifting oats in bleached winnowing machines. Driven by vengeance, the wronged Klebnikov made straight for the secluded yard. And I mean, in just 2 paragraphs there, we have this entire picture of who this person is, what his life is like, what the environment is like. And Babel is just, he's so direct. He just dives straight in. He has this absolutely natural way. The way he describes the sun streamed full strength into the yard, yet seemed to despair at the inadequacy of its rays. And he just creates these feelings. Later on, he has Klebnikov turned on his heels. His spurs rang plaintively. He went out of the yard like a dispatch rider, carrying an urgent message. And it feels like a Western. You know, the way Babel crafts these characters and stories, they first seem to be archetypes, but the way he characterizes them, he makes them so lived in. We feel these characters, we smell these characters, we hear them when they speak. And that was something I found in Solace, was he's creating all of these characters within the Spanish Civil War who just, they abound with personality. And with Babel, he writes about this conflict between these 2 officers and how it sort of transpires, and then a character who's unhappy with how the conflict is unresolved, really, then decides to indict the entire Communist Party in Russia for that, and wants to resign, and they're trying to remonstrate with him, and he's causing a scene. And so the story closes, but Babel takes all of this conflict. There's characters who you feel in a moment are about to murder one another. And then Babel closes it by saying, his troop had a samovar. During lulls in the fighting, he and I would drink hot tea together. We were both shaken by the same passions. The 2 of us looked upon the world as a meadow in May, over which wander women and horses. And it's astonishing for Babel, who had grown up in the sort of the Jewish part of Odessa in the Ukraine, and then was suddenly thrust into riding along with these Cossack cavalry in a horrifying war after World War I, immediately after World War I. And he takes these moments and he just imbues them with such a deep humanity and such a deft characterization. And he's one of my favorite writers. And as I was reading Uncertain Glory, I found myself turning and wanting to dip into somebody who would elicit sort of a different side of the same coin. And that ended up being Isaac Babel. So if you've never read any of Babel's short stories, I highly, highly recommend them. I think he's a master stylist, and just someone who, despite seeing the worst of humanity, could also find the best in them in moments. So thank you, BookTube.